In the violent age of the samurai, victory was supposed to belong to the strongest warrior, the fastest blade, the most disciplined school of swordsmanship, or the noble bloodline that had trained for generations. Samurai culture was built on these beliefs. Warriors devoted their lives to mastering rigid techniques, memorizing forms passed down from master to student for centuries. Entire schools of swordsmanship competed for prestige and recognition, each claiming to possess the most perfect method of combat. But history has a habit of revealing something uncomfortable. Sometimes the greatest masters are not the ones who follow tradition. Sometimes they are the ones who quietly break it. One man in particular would do exactly that. He was not born into a famous clan. He did not inherit an elite school of swordsmanship, and he had no powerful lord protecting him. Instead, he walked a far more dangerous path, the path of a wandering warrior. His name was Miyamoto Musashi. Across his lifetime, Musashi fought more than 60 duels. And according to the historical records that survive, he never lost a single one. This alone would have been enough to earn him a place in legend. But what truly made Musashi extraordinary was not simply his ability with a sword, it was the way he thought about combat. Where other warriors focused only on technique, Musashi focused on understanding the entire structure of conflict. He studied rhythm, timing, distance. He observed the emotional state of his opponents, their posture, their impatience, their fear. Musashi believed that a duel was not decided by the final strike of a blade. It was decided much earlier, often before the combatants even met. To Musashi, the battlefield was not only physical, it was psychological. And once he understood this truth, he began using it as a weapon. To understand Musashi's philosophy, we must first understand the world that shaped him. Japan during the late 16th century was a country that had endured nearly a century of chaos. Powerful warlords fought endlessly for control of land, castles, and political dominance. Armies moved across the countryside like shifting storms. Entire villages were burned, castles were besieged, and alliances changed constantly as ambitious leaders sought advantage over their rivals. This period became known as the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. It was an age where military skill determined survival. For samurai warriors, the sword was not merely a cultural symbol, it was their profession. From childhood, samurai trained relentlessly. They practiced swordsmanship, archery, horseback combat, and battlefield tactics. Many devoted their entire lives to mastering a single school of combat. Yet despite all of this training, the Sengoku period revealed an important reality. Even the most disciplined warriors could fall in an instant. One misjudged movement, one moment of hesitation, that was all it took. This environment forced warriors to adapt quickly. Those who relied purely on tradition often perished. Those who learned to observe, adapt, and evolve survived. Musashi would eventually become one of the most dangerous examples of this principle, because he did not treat combat as a fixed system. He treated it as a constantly changing puzzle. Musashi's first duel took place when he was only 13 years old. At this age, most boys were still years away from serious combat training. But Musashi had already begun testing himself against experienced warriors. His opponent was a samurai named Arima Kihei, a man trained in one of the established schools of martial discipline. By every traditional expectation, the outcome of this duel should have been obvious. A trained adult swordsman against a boy barely entering adolescence. But Musashi approached the duel with a mindset that ignored those expectations entirely. When the confrontation began, Musashi did not attempt to follow the careful formalities that many samurai preferred. Instead, he attacked aggressively and without hesitation. The suddenness of the attack caught his opponent off guard. Before the older warrior could fully organize his defense, Musashi struck repeatedly. The duel ended quickly. The 13-year-old boy had killed a trained samurai. It was a brutal introduction to the world of dueling. But it also revealed something about Musashi that would define his entire career. He was not interested in tradition for its own sake. He was interested in victory. If a strategy worked, he used it. If a rule slowed him down, he ignored it. And this willingness to abandon convention would eventually make him one of the most feared swordsmen in Japan. After his first duel, Miyamoto Musashi began walking a path that few warriors would ever attempt. Rather than serving a powerful lord or joining an established school of swordsmanship, he chose the life of a wandering ronin, a samurai without a master. For many warriors, this was a desperate existence. Without a lord to provide protection or income, a ronin lived entirely by his own ability. Survival depended on skill, reputation, and the ability to defeat any challenger who appeared along the road. But for Musashi, this life offered something invaluable: freedom. Freedom to travel. Freedom to test himself against the strongest swordsmen in the country. Freedom to observe how different warriors fought and how different schools of combat approached the art of the sword. Throughout his early adulthood, Musashi traveled across Japan, challenging masters from various martial traditions. Each duel became another opportunity to learn. He studied their footwork, their rhythm, the distance they preferred when engaging an opponent. Musashi was not simply fighting these men, he was analyzing them. And with each encounter, his understanding of combat grew deeper. He began to realize that most warriors were predictable. They relied heavily on the techniques they had practiced for years. But when those techniques failed, they often struggled to adapt. Musashi believed that true mastery did not come from memorizing forms. It came from understanding the principles behind movement, timing, and perception. Once those principles were understood, a warrior could adapt to any situation. This mindset slowly transformed Musashi into something far more dangerous than a skilled swordsman. It made him a strategist. As Musashi's reputation grew, another pattern began to emerge in his duels. He was not only defeating his opponents, he was unsettling them. One of Musashi's most unusual tactics was his habit of arriving late to duels. Sometimes he would appear minutes late. Other times, he would arrive hours after the appointed time. His opponents would stand waiting in the sun, growing increasingly frustrated. Their emotions would begin to shift. First irritation, then anger, then impatience. And by the time Musashi finally appeared, their mental balance had already been disrupted. This was no accident. Musashi understood that combat begins in the mind. When anger enters the battlefield, clarity disappears. A warrior who fights with frustration becomes predictable. Their movements become rushed. Their decisions become reckless. Musashi, on the other hand, remained calm, his breathing steady, his mind clear. By the time the duel began, the psychological advantage was already his. This concept would later become one of the central ideas in his philosophy. Control the rhythm of the battle. Disrupt the rhythm of your opponent. Victory will follow. Over the years, Musashi continued refining another unusual aspect of his fighting style. Most samurai used a single sword in combat. But Musashi began experimenting with something unconventional. He trained himself to fight with two swords at the same time. One long sword and one shorter blade. This approach would eventually become known as the Niten Ichi Ryu style, the strategy of two heavens as one. The idea was simple but powerful. By using both weapons simultaneously, Musashi could control distance in ways that traditional swordsmen could not. The longer sword allowed him to strike from farther away. The shorter blade allowed him to defend or counterattack instantly. But the true advantage of this method was not simply mechanical, it was psychological. Most opponents had never encountered such a style before. Their training had not prepared them for it. And when a warrior encounters something unfamiliar in combat, hesitation appears. Musashi understood this perfectly. Surprise creates openings. Confusion creates vulnerability. And vulnerability creates victory. Yet even with dozens of victories behind him, Musashi's greatest challenge still awaited. By the early 17th century, another swordsman had gained enormous fame throughout Japan. His name was Sasaki Kojiro. Kojiro was known for wielding an unusually long sword called the monohoshizao, a weapon so long that it allowed him to strike opponents from a greater distance than most swordsmen could manage. His signature technique, known as the swallow cut, was said to be nearly impossible to defend against. Stories of Kojiro's skill spread quickly. Many considered him one of the most dangerous duelists in the country. Eventually, the inevitable happened. A duel between Musashi and Kojiro was arranged. The location would be a small island. Isolated, with no distractions. Two legendary swordsmen. One final confrontation. Word of the duel spread rapidly. By the day it was scheduled to take place, boats filled with spectators gathered near the island to witness what many believed would be the greatest duel of the era. Kojiro arrived early. He stood waiting on the shore, his long blade resting calmly at his side. Time passed. The morning sun climbed higher, but Musashi did not appear. Minutes turned into an hour. The tension among the crowd began to rise, and Kojiro's patience began to fade. Then finally, a small boat approached the island. Inside it sat Musashi, calm, silent. During the journey across the water, Musashi had carved a weapon from one of the boat's wooden oars. The makeshift sword was longer than Kojiro's blade. When Musashi stepped onto the shore, the duel began almost immediately. Kojiro moved first, but in the brief instant before his strike could land, Musashi swung the wooden weapon with full force. The blow struck Kojiro in the head. The legendary swordsman collapsed, and just like that, the duel was over. Musashi turned and walked away from the island. Another opponent defeated, another legend added to his name. But Musashi's greatest contribution to history would not come from the duels he fought. It would come from the ideas he left behind. After decades of combat, Musashi eventually withdrew from the life of constant dueling. Instead, he began reflecting on everything he had learned, the patterns he had observed, the principles that governed victory and defeat. Near the end of his life, Musashi retreated to a quiet cave known as Rei Gando. There, he began writing a short text that would later become one of the most influential works on strategy ever created. The Book of Five Rings. In this work, Musashi described combat not simply as a physical contest, but as a system of perception and understanding. He divided his teachings into 5 sections: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. Each represented a different aspect of strategy. Earth described the foundation, the structure of the path. Water represented adaptability, the ability to change shape depending on the situation. Fire represented the chaos of battle, the moment where decisions must be made quickly and without hesitation. Wind represented the study of other schools, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of rival methods. And finally, there was the void, the most mysterious concept of all, the state where a warrior moves without conscious thought, where perception becomes instinct, and action flows naturally without hesitation. Musashi believed that true mastery existed within this state, a place beyond rigid technique, a place where strategy and intuition become one. As Miyamoto Musashi grew older, the duels that had once defined his life slowly faded into the past. Years of constant combat had sharpened his mind in ways that few warriors could ever understand. He had faced masters of famous sword schools. He had fought opponents who were faster, stronger, and more experienced. And yet he had remained undefeated. But Musashi did not attribute his victories simply to skill with a blade. To him, the sword was only a tool. What truly determined victory was something deeper. Understanding. Musashi believed that every form of conflict followed patterns. Patterns of rhythm, patterns of perception, patterns of human emotion. Most warriors focused only on technique. They practiced strikes, they memorized movements, they perfected forms. But Musashi believed that true mastery came from something far more subtle: seeing the battle clearly. When a warrior becomes consumed by anger, their movements become predictable. When a warrior becomes consumed by fear, hesitation appears. When a warrior becomes consumed by pride, they lose the ability to adapt. Musashi understood that the greatest advantage in combat was not speed or strength, it was clarity. The ability to observe without being controlled by emotion. The ability to remain calm while everything around you becomes chaotic. This philosophy extended far beyond the battlefield. Musashi believed that strategy was not limited to the sword. The same principles governed leadership, decision-making, competition. Victory in any arena required the same qualities: awareness, patience, discipline, and above all, the ability to see reality without illusion. In the Book of Five Rings, Musashi wrote that a warrior must study strategy as deeply as a craftsman studies his tools. A master carpenter understands every piece of wood. A skilled general understands every movement of an army. And a true strategist understands the structure of conflict itself. This way of thinking allowed Musashi to transcend the role of a simple swordsman. He became something far more rare: a philosopher of combat. His teachings would survive long after the age of samurai faded. Military commanders would study his work, business leaders would study his ideas, and generations of martial artists would search for the deeper meaning hidden within his words. Because Musashi had discovered something timeless: victory is rarely decided in the moment of action. It is decided long before, in preparation, in awareness, in the quiet discipline of a mind that refuses to be shaken. In the end, the legend of Miyamoto Musashi was not built only upon the duels he fought. It was built upon the way he understood the nature of struggle itself. The sword in his hand was only the visible symbol of that understanding. His true weapon was perception, the ability to see the rhythm of conflict, and to strike at the precise moment when victory becomes inevitable. And perhaps that is the final lesson Musashi leaves behind. In every contest, in every challenge, in every battle we face, the outcome often belongs not to the strongest, but to the one who understands the game being played. And once that understanding is achieved, the battle is already won.